I think that it's come down to looking at systems for delivering infrastructure and services to people, and not just the infrastructure and services that kind of people are assumed to need in a technocratic sense, but the infrastructure and services that people want. So what these systems ultimately come down to, and by system kind of organizations, processes, practices, means of communication, I think over the past 10, 11 years now actually working on these kind of systems for infrastructure and services, it's come down to information flow. And within the city context, it's very interesting because what you see in cities in India is there is much more potential due to kind of the concentration of access to IT, the access to cell phones, the increasing wealth in cities, for a completely different kind of dialogue between citizen and state. Unfortunately, India has gotten very far in technology in a technical sense, in a programming sense, and in a sense that has been very abstracted from usage. And I think that's actually been damaging for looking at the role of technology within an organization and user-focused, the understanding that technology imposes a certain order and a hierarchy that ends up being reflected in human work process. And that you can use technology in some sense to achieve institutional and governance reform simply by specifying user roles in, say, a complaints management system, and that potential has not been fully realized. The other sort of way I see technology is as kind of the hub of a communication system that has to extend offline. So there may be sort of a central clearinghouse among those who are connected to the internet or connected to now a cell phone to connect to the internet, but that information has to be capable of skipping over the person who's connected to people who are within 2 or 3 degrees of being connected. And that, from an information systems design perspective, is a really exciting question, because it says you don't need to get your information sort of organized for electronic dissemination, but you have to think, how is somebody going to print it? How is somebody going to broadcast this over the radio? And it's conquering those questions where I think that technology will really fully be technology for development. So there are a lot of constraints. I mean, I think on an institutional level, there's the minor constraint of tendering for e-governance systems. The tenders, in order to write a tender to produce a system that is organizationally sensitive, one already has to have kind of a combination of the knowledge of the solution sets, the knowledge of the things that technology can do, along with the knowledge of the problem set. So one has to be a sort of a practitioner. And we don't have people who have, there aren't that many people anywhere in the world, I mean, even here, there are other elsewhere, who have both the solution and the problem set in their heads and can fully envision the possibilities in order to write the tender to build the systems. So that's one big issue. Another big issue, I think, is that there's been too much focus on a very mundane form of digital divide, which is simply access to being able to touch a piece of technology, and not as a canyon in which information can fall. And once you look into that canyon, you think, what are the, I mean, I'm trained as an economist, so I think of incentives. What are the incentives for people to push information into the system, and what are the incentives to pull it out? Because they will figure out how to touch a piece of technology if you create the incentives for them to want to pull the information. And that perspective, I think, has been lost in a lot of the development dialogue about digital divide being a physical access question. It's in some sense a question of pricing, because these kinds of questions have been addressed in the private sector very effectively, in the for-profit private sector, but they're starting to be addressed in the not-for-profit sort of third sector more and more effectively. And I think within the government there's more and more sort of tech savviness. I mean, I did one study, for example, in Karnataka studies, looking at the adoption of e-governance and the level of sophistication of user suggestions on how to improve the system. And in the first year, people were asking for more hardware, the typical, I want another computer, I want another cell phone, whatever else. By the 3rd or 4th year, the conversations that were happening were about information routing, privacy access, user control, which says to me that this set of problem set and solution sets are starting to come together. So you can have user-driven innovation, which I think is the key to designing these systems. So I think it's incredibly exciting, sort of on several levels. I mean, one is it's the pedagogical level. I mean, I think a lot of the discussion that I've heard has been very focused on producing people who not only know some things, but have a way of thinking and a way of asking questions, which is something that, in my experience teaching in the US and in India, is not something that's taught well at an undergraduate level, and is something that is just desperately needs to be taught. I mean, I think around the world. So in that sense, it's an exciting pedagogical experiment. I think on the link between the curriculum and the goals and the sort of the larger integrated view of the process of development is equally exciting. The success or failure of reaching these broad goals is going to come down to the micro incentives that, what kind of incentives do faculty face? What's the faculty ecology? And these are all questions that I think, from what I've seen, are being tackled and thought about in a serious way. It's not another sort of, here's a broad goal and then we'll put a bunch of smart people in a room. That these micro questions are going to be an example for institutions, definitely not just in India, but around the world, because no one's quite conquered this yet, but it seems that it's on a path to do it. I do think that there are some tough questions about sequencing, about where to start with, what are the most important things to do first, next, and until 2030, 2050. And from what I've heard, there is not, there are a lot of great ideas, but ultimately there's going to have to be a prioritization over time of these great ideas, and I think that's the hardest part, especially when it's been such a consultative process. And I think there are going to have to be some controversial calls taken to exclude very valuable, very necessary, very socially worthy endeavors in order to find the niche and do it very well. So that's one. The other big challenge is just logistically the constraints of operating in the legal environment. I think meeting the goals within the current context and the supply of faculty and students and so on is also going to be challenging.